Let me make sure my mic's working, first of all, as we've been having technical problems here at the school, so I'm using another room today. The people here already know it, and the people that aren't here, it doesn't matter. Yep, it looks like it's okay. Maybe I'll up the level of the microphone a little bit, if I can. Doesn't look like I can. All right. So, we started talking about PHP, and I can't emphasize this enough. Your first job is to make sure that you have a server installed correctly. Now, I would guess most of you on your machine at home do not have a server installed yet, unless you've done it since like the last class. All right, unless you've done it as part of this class. So make sure you have a server installed. How do you tell if you have a server installed to begin with? Well, if you might have IIS, Internet Information Systems, in which case look for the folder C inet pub www root on your machine. And if your machine has that, then you probably have IIS installed. The way you test that is to copy the files from the example into CINET pub www root and type in localhost / and then the name of the file. So if you copy this week's examples, which I'll make sure are downloadable, you would type it in and type in localhost / first.php. If you do not have a server installed, I would suggest that you install XAMPP. And I have a video about installing that. Whoops. So take a minute and watch this. You can tell it was made last semester because I have less hair and less beard. This actually might have been 2 semesters ago. I don't remember. Maybe 3. I don't know. When did the pandemic start? All right. Anyhow, we're going to look at our first example again, because we talked about it last time, but I feel that we were a little rushed. So therefore, I am going to spend some time reviewing that again. All right, so I do have my server installed. I've moved my files to CINET pub www root. Remember, if you're working with server-side code, it needs to be processed by a web server. You can't simply open up the file in a browser like you did with HTML pages. You have to ask for the files from a server that has been installed and has PHP, which if you install XAMPP, it will. All right. And then you should see the proper results. So use this sort of as a test for your own install. Now, to refresh your memory about what this example looked like, I have to ask for it from the server. So my server on my own machine is called localhost. Now, this might be a little different if you are running XAMPP, because you might have localhost and some number after it, some 3-digit or 4-digit number. That is your port number. So look at the documentation of XAMPP and see what if your local web server has a particular port associated with it or not. You should be able to find that. And as always, if you have any questions, just ask me, and I'll be glad to help. So anyhow, I want the file first.php. The file is in the web server's root location. All right. So all I have to do is type in localhost / first.php. If it was in a subfolder under the root directory, you would put in localhost / name of my directory / first.php. And what this is this is a simple times, well, not really a times table, it's a squared table. But what it does is it takes I going from 1 to 100, squares it, and displays the results. Now, again, even though this is a pretty simple example, it is a good example of PHP, because if you had to make a page like this, you wouldn't want to hand code the HTML for it, right? Because you'd have to do the multiplication by yourself. Even if you used a calculator, you're liable to touch the wrong buttons and get an incorrect result, and it would be very tedious besides. And it would be hard to maintain, because if your boss says, gee, we love that page so much, we want to go to up to 1,000, it would be like, oh, you'd have a even bigger task still. All right, so we're doing this with PHP. So what we are doing is we're actually using PHP to write the HTML. If we look at the source code that the browser gets, the browser doesn't see PHP code. The browser sees HTML code. That's because the PHP code writes the HTML. Notice, for example, here, there's going to be a loop, and each time through the loop, a TR is going to be created that contains 2 TDs, and it's going to output the number and the number squared. All right. So we don't see PHP code when the page is delivered to the browser. We see the result of the PHP code, which is going to be HTML. All right, so let's look at the PHP code for this. And I did 2 versions of it. We'll take a brief look at this. This should be review. But as I said, I kind of went over it quickly last week, so we'll spend a little more time looking at it. All right. Page starts out looking like an HTML page. That's what PHP is, or that's what PHP pages are. They're HTML pages that have been souped up. All right. They have the added ingredient of PHP code. And you know that you have PHP code when you see this declaration. This and this wraps around PHP code. So anytime you see this and this somewhere down the line, everything in between is PHP code. Okay? You know that for a fact. It's not HTML. Every time you see a print statement, the server is going to output HTML to the browser. So print bracket table bracket is going to output a table tag to the browser. And sure enough, if we look at this code, we can see the table tag that gets outputted. Good. I'm always afraid I'm going to forget to record. The next line of PHP outputs a TR, a TH, the word number, a TH, another TH, the word squared, and the NTH and NTR tag. That so far is static HTML that we're outputting. All right, and we can see it. It's a TR, a TH, the number, the TH squared, the NTR. So that gets outputted to the browser. Then at the very end, we output an end table tag, which you can see way down here. Now what happens in between is the interesting part, because we have a loop. And we have a loop that goes from n equals 1, and it will repeat as long as n is less than or equal to 100. In other words, this loop will execute 100 times. The first time it will execute, n will have a value of 1. The second time it executes, it will have 1 plus that, so it will have 2. Then it'll be 3, 4, all the way up through 100. By the way, if I'm describing variables in PHP, I probably will say N or S. Know that PHP variables begin with $signs. So in your head, translate N to $N, all right? Because that's the variable name. PHP variable names begin with a $sign. So what does this do in the loop? Well, it takes N, multiplies it by itself, and puts the result in S. Now, notice something here that is both a blessing and a curse. All right? I did not have to declare those variables. All right? PHP is like kind of an old school language and it is what's called loosely typed. That means that PHP sort of figures out the data type that you're using, kind of like JavaScript. In other words, it knows that N is a number because we put numbers in it. All right? We could actually a second later put a string in it. All right? And it would still work, except when it got to the multiplication, then it would blow up. Or I should rephrase that. It wouldn't still work. It would, you know what I mean. So we don't declare the variables. $N is the name of the variable. Variables start with $signs. And each time through the loop, we multiply by itself, and then we output to the browser. When you see the word print in PHP code, think output to the browser or send to the browser. So what do we send to the browser? We send TR, TD, $N, NTD, TD, $S, TD, TR. So we send one of these. Actually, we don't send one of these. We send 100 of these to the browser because that loops through 100 times. Now, here is something that's cool about PHP. All right? They're called the magic quotes. All right? Why are they magic? Because notice what I have embedded inside this big string. I have $N and $S. All right? Whenever PHP sees $N or $anything, $S or whatever, it assumes that you mean the variable named N and the variable named S. So this will plop into this string. At this point, the variable named N, and at this point, the variable named S. Okay? Now, there's ways we might talk about later about what if you don't want it to assume that. What if you just want to show a $? Well, you can escape the code, and there's some other things that you can do beyond this. But for right now, it's enough to say that the $N and $S gets put right in this expression. Now, if you remember in other languages, you'd have to do something like this. If we were doing this in JavaScript, for example, always confuses me when it pastes and includes the format. There we go. This is how we do it in PHP code. We're going to do the same thing in JavaScript, assuming our variables were named S and N. Would have to do something like this. Would have to say that literal plus the value of N plus this literal plus the value of s plus this literal. I will put it all on one line here. So once you learn how to do this, it's not that hard, right? Anything that you literally want, you enclose in quotes. Anytime you want the value of a variable, you do plus the variable outside of quotes. Yeah, some students find that confusing, and frankly, it's a hassle to do that sometimes. It's not that it's like difficult, it's just a pain, sort of. This is so much nicer because you can just write what you want outputted, and you can substitute wherever you want the value of a variable. You can put in the name of the variable, including the $sign. So we've looped through 100 times. We have outputted the number and the squared, and therefore we create, and they're contained in a TR that contains 2 TDs, which we saw in the HTML. And when it's all done, we get this times table, or square table, rather. Now, again, we can do some pretty cool things with this now that we have a script writing the code instead of us writing the code. What if we wanted this to go to 1,000? Well, change this loop to go to 1,000. By the way, if you're working on the machines in here and you get some message about you have to be administrator, if you just click through it, it will let you do it. But it's just reminding you that you're doing administrative things. That was a mistake I made that when Mike Harmich came in, he corrected for me. So anyhow, I want to have it go to 1,000. Can you imagine if I did this as a plain old HTML page, I would have to go and add 900 rows to my table. Here, I just change the value, and I'm good to go. Goes all the way up to 1,000. What if I wanted to add cubed to this? What all would I have to add a column for the value of the number cubed? What would I have to change? Yes. Yep, exactly. I would just go C equals Q N times N times N. Whoops, times $N. This is one nice thing about when you code using Visual Studio Code, is it to a degree understands the languages. So it doesn't catch every error, but it'll kind of code that like, hey, something's different about that. And it reminded me I need to put the $sign there. Doesn't tell me that I need a semicolon after it, but oh well. Doesn't do everything for you. So I'm going to go and add the column for cubed. I'll add the heading for cubed. And away we go. And there we go. Question. What if we wanted to apply CSS to this? Can we apply CSS to PHP code? That's a trick question. The answer is we do not apply CSS to PHP code, but we can apply CSS to the output of PHP code. So, for example, and I'm going to do this all into one file so it's not confusing. If I wanted to add and make all the headers bigger, let's say I just want to add some things to style this table. All right. There is no HTML in here for the table, but the PHP creates a table. So I can add CSS to that. So I can say table with 60% TH, font size 1.2 M. M means it's emphasized 1.2 times or 1.2 times the default size. Then finally, for good measure, TDs, if you remember, are aligned to the left. No. Yeah, they are aligned to the left. I could make it align center to match up with the headers. So I can say text align center. And even though there's none of these in the plain HTML portion of the page, they're created by the PHP portion of the page, and therefore the style will apply. All right. What if I wanted to put a class in here? All right. If I wanted to put a class, let's see. Let's say I don't want to do it to every table. I just want to do it to my math table. Those things with a class of math. Then I would have to create it, that table tag with a class of math. In other words, I would have to say class equals, If I do that, guess what? It's going to get confused. All right. Why? Because when it sees this quote, it's going to think that it is the end of the string, when actually we want that quote inside of the string. So what do? That's called escaping characters. And you could do this also with the $sign if you wanted to. And I'm going to refresh my memory. I think I know how to do it, but I think it's a backslash. Slash to escape quote within a double quoted string. So now it knows that that's one big string, and it knows that I want the quote as part of the string. The quote isn't the delineator of the end of the string. And it still works. Oh, I changed the style. I changed the style to a style of class, and let's make the width 60 and we'll make the color blue. Remember, the CSS code that you write relates to what gets sent to the browser, not the PHP code itself. And there we go. All right. Questions about this part? Let's look at my second example. And I'm going to pull it up. Here, notice the output is identical to the way this was outputted originally. So if I do view source, only difference is it looks like it's formatted a little neater. Now, generally, we don't care about the way our PHP code is formatted, because if we're going to debug, we're probably going to debug the PHP code, not the HTML code. But it is always useful to look at the PHP code that gets generated. If, for example, you output an image tag in PHP and you think you did it right, but the image doesn't display right, then look at the HTML that gets generated, and that will tell you, it'll give you a hint as to what you did wrong. All right, so you would use the HTML to sort of see what actually got outputted to the browser, and then you'd look at the HTML or the PHP code to see how it was outputted to the browser. So I guess there's a slight advantage to this in that the output of the PHP is a little neater. Now let's look at the code for this one. And it's about the same. I have the same loop. Same table created. Same end table. The difference with this is my PHP only outputs very little. All right. Now, this is either great or this is confusing. I don't care which way you do it. If this is hard to understand, then do it the first way. But you can either have PHP write all the HTML for a certain section of the page, or you can have PHP simply fill in some blanks in the HTML code that you write. So for example, I don't use the print statement to output this out. I just have a plain TR. I don't use a print statement to output the table. That's in HTML land. It's outside of the PHP declarative. But what's inside the PHP declarative is this, which means that it's going to repeat these statements 100 times. So it's going to generate 100 rows. All right. Still does the same math. Still can output the value of n and the value of s. But instead of outputting the entire TD tag, we output the middle of the TD tag. Now, this is where it gets confusing for some, and it gets confusing if you have like really long pages, that this brace matches this brace. So the actual for statement is carried over 2 PHP blocks. All right. If there's a lot of lines in between them, that can get confusing, especially if you have nested if statements, nested loops, or whatever. Questions about this approach? Now, this is where the fun starts. All right. You know, people always ask, are we having fun yet? Yes, we're about to have fun. All right. Trust me. Because this is all well and good. But what if I didn't want 1,000 every time? What if I wanted the user to be able to say how many lines I wanted to generate? I would allow the user to generate based on the value of a form, for example. So I now have two things. I didn't style this very much, but I have a starting value and an ending value. So I could put in a starting value of 3, let's say, and an ending value of 12. And click process. And then my loop goes from 3 to 12. Or I could say 1 to 10,000. And it goes from 1 to 10,000. All right. In other words, what I'm doing, and this is something that you need to do for your first assignment, and you'll need to do for every assignment, I would imagine, in this class anyhow, is you're getting the value from a form and using it in PHP. Now, if you remember in CISS232, we talked about how to make forms, right? But we didn't write any scripts, all right? We said, well, that's not covered in this class. Well, this is a class it is covered in, all right? This class and another class. Because we use the value from the form to output and to change the output of the page that we're generating. So let's look at form.php. Interestingly enough, form.php doesn't have any PHP in it. All right. Could I have made this an HTML file? Yes, I could. I can have an HTML file that calls a PHP file. All right. That's not a problem at all. I would still need to access it through the server because PHP is getting involved, but I could write an HTML file and then have it call the PHP code. I would still have to type in localhost form.html. All right, I couldn't just double click on it, but it would work. Notice a few things about this. The action of this is the script that's going to get called. The method is how the data is going to get passed. The data has two variables, well, actually 3, if you include the submit button. The variable start, the variable end, and the variable submit. It also has an ID. Why does it need both of those? It needs both of those because it's used for two different things. The ID is used with the label statement. The name is how it gets passed to the other page. So I can make these different, but rather than making things different and confusing things, I make them the same. It's actually more straightforward, I think, anyhow. So what's this going to do? This is going to take and call this page, and it's going to append on it a query string. How do I know it's going to append on it a query string? Because the method is get. The other method, which maybe we'll do this one, is a method of post. And the main difference is that get shows you the values that get passed on the query string, where post does not. It passes them a different way. All right. So the names of the things on the query string will be start and end and submit. So if we type this in and we say 1 to 100, let's look at this query. Let's look at this URL closer. It's important that you understand where these pieces come from. How does it know to put localhost in front of it? First of all, we know it has to, right? Because this is a PHP page. We have to get it through the server. The reason it knows to use localhost is that if we only specify the name of a page, it will assume that it is on the same server in the same folder, which this is. This is also in localhost server, my server, and it's also in the folder C inetpub www root. So that's where it gets the localhost at the beginning. It's a default. Could that be something else? Yes. For example, I think in CISS232, we wrote a form that submitted to Google search and had Google do a search, in which case our script was not on our machine, was not on our web server, was not in the same folder, but on Google's web server. And I think your form example, you submitted to a different server to display the results of your form. All right. Where does first PHP come from? First PHP comes from the action of the form. So the action of the form is what determines what script gets called. Where does this come from? Well, the $sign means it's going to be passed on the query string. So that's what gives us the question mark. This is going to be every element in the form that has a name. So what elements have a name? This text box, and this button. The name of it is going to be used to give you the name of the thing that it's passing. You're going to get an equal sign, and then you're going to get the value of that text box or whatever. Now, here's an important difference between PHP land and JavaScript land. PHP doesn't know anything about where that data came from. Did it come from a text box? Did it come from a drop-down? Did it come from checkboxes? Did it come from radio buttons? Doesn't know about that. All it knows is it came from something that had a name start and something that had a name end. And finally, that button had a name submit. And since we clicked on the button, we get the value of the button. The name of the button equals the value of the button. Now, I want to make a small change here. I want to make a drop down for this last value. All right. Just to demonstrate that it doesn't really matter. So I'm going to say select ID equals end. I'm being close. I'm being careful to give it the same name and ID because we'll be able to do this without changing any of our PHP code, even though we changed where that data came from. And I can put in I'm going to do something that might seem goofy, but I'm doing it deliberately. I'm going to write the word 100 to illustrate a point. Let's just give them two choices. All right. So I'm going to save this. Now I have my drop down, and I can type in from 1 to 100. Or I can pick 1,000. And it generated it from 1 to 1,000. Now, notice what got passed in the URL, the value for end. The value for end in the URL is the number 100 and not the word 1,000. Why is that? Because it gives you the value of the option and not the HTML for the name of the option. All right, now it's what displayed, but the value. So you're going to have two different things. More than likely, you're going to have two different things when you do a drop down. You're going to have what the user wants to see and what the server needs to do its job. So the server can't process the word 100. All right. Therefore, you make the value the number 100. The server can't process the name, the string 100. All right. Now that may come out in other ways later on when you do more elaborate things. If you're going to do a drop-down list of professors, let's say at the college, each professor might have their own assigned professor number, professor ID. The value of the option then would be their professor ID, and what gets displayed to the user would be the professor name. All right. So remember, this is what the user is going to see, and it has to be understandable to the user. This is going to be what the script is going to see, and it needs to be understandable by the script. It needs to be what the script is expecting. Now, I know if you leave off the value, it will default it to the HTML. I think so anyhow. I would never do that. Make it clear. Take the extra 2 seconds to type in a value, even if the value matches what I have there. All right. But notice that my script did not care anything about the fact that that number now came from a dropdown. If I look at the URL, it looks identical to it the way it did before, except maybe the value of end. Because remember, this is a request. It's not a web page. Only web pages have dropdowns and other stuff. Requests have query strings, and the format of a query string is always the name of the field, an equal sign, and the value for the field. Notice something else. Strictly speaking, what gets passed on the query string is a string. All right? It is a string. But my PHP didn't care about that. My PHP didn't care that it was a string. All right? It worked just fine. Again, that's the nature of a weakly typed language, that the language figures out what something is supposed to be based on the data that you put into it. Now, that's a blessing and a curse. The blessing part is that's less work for you to do. I don't have to declare something as an integer. The curse, though, is I can do something horrible like putting a string inside an integer and my program blows up and I don't know why. All right. It automatically does this conversion and stores this as a number. For this to work, this is a submit button. The submit button is going to send, is what says, you know, as Captain Picard would say, make it so. It's going to call this script, pass on the query string these values. All right, now let's look at the PHP that processes that. All right, I took the second example, and it's the same, except I use this command to pull the value from the query string. $start equals, pull from the request the value of the name start. Pull from the request the value of the name end. So this start and end has to match this start and end. After it does that, well, the rest just works, all right? Instead of running my array from 1 to 1,000 or whatever, I start at the value that I want to start at, and I end at the value that I want to end with. Now, there's a couple problems with this that we won't address today, but we'll address in upcoming weeks. Namely, what happens if we enter in something invalid? Well, let's do it for the heck of it. See what happens. Interesting. It interprets a space as a 0, which doesn't sound good to me. This blew up. Or interpret it, I don't know as what. What if I try to go backwards? It doesn't show anything as well. So if we were smart, which we are, we're going to add validation to this. Or we would add validation to this. I don't know if I'll use this example for validation or use a different example for validation. All right. But so far, we have that process. Now, I want to demonstrate something. There actually are two other variations of using request. I can use get, which pulls from the query string, or I can use post, which pulls from what's called the form collection. All right. And it shows me that I can use get or I could use post, or I could actually pull this from a cookie, if it remembered the last search I did. If I use request, it will find it either if the page is posted to, or if the page is posted to with a query string, or if the page is posted and the data is passed on the form collection. So for example, if I change this to post, still going to work. The only difference is it doesn't get sent on the query string, so we can't see it. Right? Which one do you use? Well, using post is more secure. It doesn't expose your data to someone via the URL if it would be sensitive data. If you want to call something from a number of different places and even make a link to it, like we could make a link that said first3.php question mark first equals 1 or start equals 1, end equals 100, and we could call it. All right. So there are advantages of using the query string. Generally speaking, you probably want to use the post most of the time, but there are reasons to do the query string because you can make a link and pass query string items also. I will probably use get most of the time simply to demonstrate that about the data that gets passed. All right, just to refresh your memory about that. If I do post, I can't show you that. Are there any questions about this? Yes. Generally, I use $_request. All right, you can use $_get and $_post. I like request if you have, if you decide to change it, you don't have to change the code. Now, There's a small drawback with doing that. What if you wanted to pass something via the query string and in the form collection, which you could do? That's kind of rare. All right. You're either passing it all one way or all the other, but it is possible. So, and you could have the same field in the form and in the query string. And in that case, you'd run into problems. I would say that's pretty unlikely. So there really isn't a drawback of using the request. Not in my mind, anyhow. If you go online and search, you'll probably find 300 pages of people arguing about it. You know, in my mind, it doesn't really make a difference. Any other questions? All right, next week, remember, is spring break, so there will be no lecture. You still can ask me questions over that time, because I'm not going anywhere, and I might work less, but I'm still going to be working over the break. Make sure you get a server installed first of all and can run these examples. That ought to be your job one. If you can do that this week, great. You know, get that done, and then work on the Mad Lib assignment. All right. Okay, we'll see you in a couple of weeks.